Hey guys, it's Kambi, and in today's video I will be doing a tutorial about tubes. So tubes are one of those shapes in the maker pen that a lot of people are a bit afraid to touch because there are so many settings. But once you understand all the settings, you'll find that it's actually quite easy to use. Also, it'll help save a lot of ink in your custom rooms and also help with the rendering of some of those shapes as well. So I'm going to be walking you through how to use all of the tube interface on our maker pen, and then I'm going to show you how to make different shapes and how to then create your own custom shapes. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do is go to your backpack or reach behind you and grab the maker pen. And what I like to do is I like to hold the trigger down on my tools tab and drag it out so that way I could make adjustments without having to keep looking down at my maker pen. And I want to go to palette, and the first shape you'll see is tube, so you want to select that. When you select tubing, there's a custom menu that appears on the right hand side. I'm going to walk you through each of these settings. The first thing to understand is your snapping. If you have no snapping on, you could draw a shape wherever you want. If you have surface on, it's going to draw it on the nearest surface. And if you have grid, it's going to draw it on the invisible rec room grid, so it'll be on perfect angles. So now that we understand snapping, for now I'm going to stay with grid, but it's important to know if you're having problems with where your tube is starting, then you'll want to adjust your snapping. All right, so next up, I'm going to make sure that I'm clicked on create, which is the top left box, and I'm going to open up create tool settings. So what you'll notice here is the first item is, do you want to create grabbable objects? Personally, I always have this turned off because if you accidentally grab what you're making using the maker pen, it might get off the grid, or it'll be hard to really line up back to where you originally had it. Also, one of your friends might come in and start messing with it. So yeah, you could always configure your grabbable objects back to grabbable, but I usually have this set to off. The other options would be the object default and on. All right, so next up, your create shape mode. So this doesn't really apply to tubing. It has to do with really the other shapes in Rec Room, so you don't really have to worry about it now. But basically, if you have a cube and I were to drag this out, it would get bigger. But if I were to have it on move, it would actually move with the maker pen. So that's all it is, but again, we're not going to go into that for today's tutorial. Next up, scale shapes with plier. So I always have this checked off just personally, but basically when you get bigger or smaller, do you want your tube to also get bigger and smaller? So I personally like to scale myself while I'm building. It's a personal option, but I keep this checked on. All right, now to the fun part, our create tube settings. So for the tube settings, you'll notice that there are three main categories. You have tube radius, tube height, and tube facets. So first we'll go through tube facets. So tube facets is how many sides your tube is going to have. If I increase this to 10, it's 10 sides. If I bring it down to 3, it's going to be a triangle. All right, so I put together this small chart and I'll just go through the tube facets. So this is 3 sides, 4 sides, 5, 6, and 10. Those are your options. There's also different end caps. So you could have a sharp end cap. So you have these sharp edges. You have smooth, or you have what's called an old end cap style. So in order to change those different preferences, you'll want to scroll down and click either on smooth or not smooth. So if I'm on not smooth, and let me just increase my size quickly, you have these sharp edges. But if I change this to smooth, you'll get these rounded edges. But there's another type of end cap that a lot of people don't know about, and it's called the old end cap. So if you configure your tube, you could actually scroll down and change your tube settings. So say I made a 3-sided shape and I really wanted it to be 6 sides. I could change it with the configuration. I could also change whether or not I want it smooth, and then if I want this old end cap style. So I know the old end cap, it looks kind of similar to the smooth, but it's slightly less rounded. It's great if you want an object, say like a pillow, that you want to be mostly flat, but not have this sort of triangle shape popping out at the end. So that's just a little tip that I have, something I didn't know about when I first started building. So I'll just step back. Let me delete what I drew, and you could just admire this beautiful chart that shows all the different sides. All right, so now that we know what our tube facets mean, now let's move over to height and radius. So your height of tube has to do with how fat or skinny the shape is. So if I have a 0.1 tube, and I believe this is using 10 sides, it's a nice skinny shape. But if it goes all the way to a 1 setting, and you could actually adjust it anywhere in between just by clicking on this little box and inputting the tube height that you want. And you'll see that at a 1.0, that is actually a perfect shape that's symmetrical. Next up, we have tube radius. So tube radius is actually all it is how big or small the tube is. So it starts at 0.01 meters and it goes all the way up to 1 being the largest. So if you want a small shape, you'll want to keep your tube radius down. If you want a large shape, you want to increase it. And just like the height, you could pick any number in between. You could also scale yourself and adjust the height with the maker pen, but to get started, I would just recommend adjusting the tube radius. All right, so now that we've gone through our main tube settings, we're going to go through a few other options. So first we have tube analog mode. So there's 3 options: off, brush, and raw. For VR users, I find personally that brush and raw are very similar, but think of raw as very sensitive to touch. When you're creating your tube, how big or small you want it to be by how you're pressing on your trigger. Brush is sensitive, but let me just move this to non-uniform. It's sensitive, but you could still have control over. If you have your analog mode off, you're always going to get a consistent shape. And the height will be the height and the radius will be the radius. I personally, unless I'm making something like a structure where I want everything to be exact, if I was doing that, I'd want it to be off, but when you're creating more abstract items, you probably want it to be on brush. At least that's my personal recommendation. Now, I know I jumped ahead a little bit, but I forgot to mention uniform shapes. So uniform shapes, if you have this checked on, you're going to get, as you guessed it, a perfect uniform shape. If I have this off, I could go in all different directions. That's all it is. It's important to keep in mind, and I will put it to use in a little bit. All right, going back down to our tube analog mode, we talked about smooth versus non-smooth and caps, and now to talk about connect near tubes. If I want to create an object and I don't want the next object that I create to be a continuation, I want to have this unchecked. So I get two different objects, but if I want to connect the objects, then I want to make sure that I have connect nearby tubes set on. Personally, I usually begin with connect near tubes unless, like I said, I'm making a specific structure where I want separate items or different colors and I don't want it to be a continuation. All right, so a few other items to note. We don't have to worry about circuits and debugging, but if you go down to your general settings, you'll want to make sure you have show pivot selected, and you could see the pivot point of the object that you're creating. That will become handy when you get to animation because your pivot point is where your object will rotate from. I personally like to always show my pivot point, but if you're having problems with rotating, it's definitely something to look into, and I will be doing another tutorial on pivot and animation. Next up, I'm going to scroll through some of these. All right, so smooth out tube twist while moving. So another really great thing you could do with tubes, and I'm going to just make a shape to illustrate the point. If I go to edit and I click on the tube, I could actually scale and move each of these different tube points that I created. If I make some rotations, this is basically telling the program, do I want to keep the twisting of the tube or do I want it to be smoothed out and less angular? So sometimes you actually do want twists for certain textures, and maybe you're making a column and you really want the twist on purpose. Yeah, you'll want to adjust the setting right over here. And lastly, let's see. I think that's really it for your tube settings. Now, next up, we're going to recreate all of the Rec Room shapes using only tube. All right, so first off, we're going to start with the cube, and I want my snapping to grid so that it's lined up perfectly with the axis. And I'm just going to use a 0.04 tube radius. I want my tube height to scale to 1 because I want it to be perfectly symmetrical. And I want my tube facets to 4. So there's 4 sides. I'll also want to change my analog mode off because I want a perfect square. And I will want to not have smooth tubes checked. I'll also, something that I didn't mention earlier is there's position snap and rotation snap. So position snap is basically the smaller the snap or the meters, the smaller the grid for all your objects. the larger the position snap, the larger the grid is. So you'll notice that my tube is further away because it has to align to a bigger grid at the moment. So I'm going to put that down to 0.01 right now, and usually I have that just as the default. Rotation snap is when you rotate an object, how many degrees do you want it to rotate? For now, I'm just going to keep that on 45. I'm not going to worry about it. And let's draw that perfect square. So what I'll notice is this is a little bit bigger than I wanted. So what I could do is change my position snap. And there we go. I could get a better size square and really anything in between. If I want to edit the first shape that I created, I can move that pivot point. And if I have snapping off, I could still move it perfectly in line with the axis. And I could get that perfect square shape. So there you go, a perfect square using tube. All right, so next up is the sphere. So the sphere is a little trickier. I'll want to make I'll keep my position snap at 0.05. I'm going to have my tube height scale to 1, and I'm going to increase my tube facets. And I'm going to leave smooth tubes off for now. And what I'll want to do is start with a really small radius. And I did turn off my pivot point just because when you're dealing with a small object, the pivot point could be really large. And I'll also want to make sure my connect nearby tubes is checked on because I'm going to be continuing this tube to create that circle. So I create the next size, the next size, the next size, and then I'm going to go down in size. And I'm just going to continue this on. Undo if you need to. There we go. So now you might be thinking, well, this does not look like a circle or a sphere. And you are absolutely correct. So we're going to do something about that. We're going to edit this shape. And then we're going to scale, turn my snapping off. And we're going to scale this until it looks like the perfect circle. And you'll want to move some points up. You'll want to use the scaling. Once you get the hang of this, it'll be fairly quick. But when you're first learning and starting out, it might take you a little bit longer. All right, if you ever want to delete a point, like you see down here, I accidentally created 2 of the same size. All you have to do is delete it. That's it. Make sure you're in edit mode when you do that. And going to scale a little bit more. Move a little bit more. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger. Now we're starting to see a circle. All right, so I know this is not perfect, but if you want to get an even more perfect circle sphere shape, you'll want to make sure you have more points in your tubing. I could also configure this object if I want and make it smooth. And it'll just kind of smooth out some of those edges. But there's a rough sphere and a great way if you want to create an avatar head. Next up, we have a cylinder. So this one's pretty easy. If you go to create, again, I'll go back to snapping on grid, keep my uniform shapes on, and keep my tube facets, I'll keep that as 10. There you go. There's a cylinder. Pretty easy, right? All right, next up, we have a wedge. So what I'll want to do for the wedge is just change my tube facets to 3, keep my tube height scale to 1, and there you go. You get a nice wedge. Next up, we have a pyramid. All right, so for the pyramid, I'm actually going to put tube facets to 4. I'm going to start with a 0.08 radius, and then I'm going to have one more point. Nope, that's not where. There we go. And I'm going to edit my points. There we go. You get a nice pyramid shape. Next up, we have the semicircle. So the semicircle is actually very similar to how I did the sphere. It's just going to be not closing the end part of the circle. So what I could do is I could go back. I want to make sure I edit first. I'm in edit mode. And all I have to do is delete the top of this circle. And then what I want to do is configure it back to non-smooth. There you go. You got a semicircle, and it just consists of just a few points. It consists of just 4 points. All right, next up, we have a cone. All a cone is really a pyramid that has 10 facets. So I just have to change that to 10 facets, and I get a cone shape. And obviously you could edit this to be different heights, but very similar shape. A big reason why we are recreating the shapes is because if you were to use a semicircle in your custom room, it might look like a square to a lot of VR players because of the way that Rec Room renders and the graphics. If you create tubing, people will always see the shape of the tubing, and that's really important. And I learned that when I created my first room and I had square hamburgers and people kept asking why they were square. Well, now I know why. All right. Next up, we have the pipe. So the pipe and donut are very similar. And this one's a lot of fun to make. So what you want to do is turn your snapping off. You'll want to turn off uniform shapes. I'm going to start with a large shape. I'm going to keep my tube height to 1. And my tube facets, I'm going to increase to 10. And I'll want a smooth tube shape, and you can keep connect nearby tubes on. What I'm going to do now is put my maker pen in my left hand, and when I hold down the trigger, I'm going to rotate with my right hand in a circle. There you go. A perfect, almost perfect donut in just a few seconds. Now, if I would want to create a pipe shape, very similar. This time I'm going to want to reduce my tube height scale. I'm going to do 0.5. And I'm going to click unsmooth and tube facets at 4. And you know what? I might actually go down on the tube height. I'm going to go down to 0.2. And I'm going to do the same circle that I just used for the donut. Obviously, this is not perfect, but with trial and error, you will get a wonderful pipe. And if I were to only spin halfway around, I would get a beautiful half pipe. For diamond, honestly, I'd really enjoy the diamond shape. I wouldn't mess with tubes. If you want to use a diamond, go ahead, go for it. It's actually pretty awesome. And I'll just show you what that looks like. Could you recreate it? Absolutely, but I don't know. There's certain shapes that I just don't mess with. All right, so now that we created our own custom tube shapes, I'm going to show you how to make just really any shape you want. So, for example, I have my snapping on grid. I have my, let's see, my tube facets on 4, my height at scale at 0.5. I have a radius, and I'm going to keep my analog mode actually on brush so I have control of how big or small I want this to be. And I'm going to begin making a shape. You know what? This is moving around a little too much. Let me increase the position snap. All right. Make sure I have connect nearby tubes because I am making a custom tube, and I'm going to not touch the trigger as much, and I'll increase it again. So I have this beautiful shape. Now, if I hit done and I hit edit, let me show my pivot point. All right, so I have a pivot point right where I want it. So I'm going to rotate this object and I'm going to clone it. First, let me just get out of edit mode. I'm going to clone it. Then I'm going to rotate it. And I want to go to world space, so it moves up and down versus the direction of the tubing itself. And if I hit clone now, I could repeat this clone all the way around. How beautiful is that? I mean, that only took, I would say, less than a minute of my time, and I just created this beautiful structure using just tube and the clone tool. So my challenge to you guys is go explore, recreate each of the Rec Room objects and shapes, and then go off and create your own shapes and begin applying this to your custom rooms. Not only will you save ink, but it'll also allow you to save time once you get the hang of it and really make some of the objects more intricate and detailed. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions, please comment below. And if there's any other tutorials that you'd like to see, also please comment in the video below. That's all I have for today. I'll see you guys later.